So hello, it's very nice to be here to talk to you. I'm principally going to talk to you about lithic material from Australia, and I'm doing that for a number of reasons. One is, in a sense, to challenge you with something different, and another is to show solidarity. The fact that in many parts of the world we're all exploring the same kinds of concerns. And so I think that it's a good opportunity for me to briefly summarise some of the attempts to move towards standard classifications in Australia and why they don't really work. Now, the fundamental reason, I'm going to talk about a bit about the history of labelling, particularly the backed specimens in Australia, and there have been quite a lot of different criteria used. The fundamental problem, though, is that we need to come back and think about what these classifications do. Typological systems in archaeology, classification in general, is a way of labelling groups so that we can explore similarity and difference. And the consequence of that is that, of course, we need different divisions and different labels when we address different questions. So my viewpoint has always been that attempting to standardise a single classificatory framework is bound to fail, because it's not going to allow you to sensitively measure the variation that you want to explore for every question. It's a really good idea for some questions, but it's self-limiting in the sense that it must, by definition, address some of the questions that you have in mind at the moment, but it can't address all the questions that everyone might ask for it. And the history of working in Australia shows that. So people have tried to define things in terms of function, functional associations, or size, or shape, or the association to particular blanks for these retouched items, or backing. So let me just quickly work through this. Now, the first thing I have to say is that if we do a morphometric study and do it in multivariate space, that the things that we're talking about, these backed objects, do fall out compared to other retouched objects. So it is possible to not just have sort of vague or even moderately well-defined divisions, but to actually measure this material, measure the angles, the dimensions, the ratios, and come up for any particular site or location with quite clear and robust means for differentiating them. And the second thing I would say is that, of course, it's talking to an audience who's highly skilled, so you'll all recognise that it's a retouched backed item at the top and an unretouched ridge straightening flake off a core at the bottom. But of course, it's very common when you go through museum collections that many of the unretouched things that have lots of scars on the dorsal ridges have been mislabelled, and hence the reason why trusting the counts published in the literature is not always a good idea. So this category of things that we're generally talking about, of items that are retouched bluntly, were first identified in Australia in 1901 and published in 1907. And it was published by Robert Etheridge, who worked in a natural science context at the Australian Museum, and he talked about them, he described them as chipped-backed surgical knives. And this is one of his illustrations, and the great thing about the illustration is you immediately know what it is, and you immediately know that he didn't know what he was really looking at, because there's no details. None of those scars are shown. He's operating on general shape, not being a modern archaeologist. Now, the original paper by Etheridge and Whiteleg cited reports such as Browth-Smythe's description of the death spear thing. We now know that first of all, the death spears are not kind of real in Australia. They're a post-contact depiction. That secondly, that the backed artefacts disappeared more than 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, so they don't have a real connection with the ethnographic record. So a lot of the attempts to understandable attempts to understand these archaeological objects by reference to the ethnography. That was the first thing that people tried, but didn't terribly work. However, the notion that these things would be mounted on spears caught hold. It was employed by McCarthy in the 1960s and 70s. It's still reproduced by Richard Fulliger today, and it's widely discussed. So, I mean, I'll come back to the fact that I'm unconvinced that any of these objects in Australia are actually used on projectiles, but this was something that focused people's attention and really was a key way in which they attempted to explore the nature and to a degree the definition of these objects. The complexity is, of course, that people like Garl Robinson have done some excellent residue wear studies. We published that in Antiquity, the reference is there. And this is just a summary for 3 sites of the kind of functions that are happening. The first thing is that you can see projectile thrusting functions basically non-existent. The second thing you can see is that operating these when they're used, and they're not all used, when they're used as tools, they can be used on bone or wood or skin or a whole variety of things, and they can be used in various ways. And these are 3 sites in the same valley. So the first thing is that characterising the Australian retouched forms of this kind, even though they seem standardised in terms of function, is quite problematic. There's no common association. They're used in a whole range of ways, and 10 kilometres away they're used for something completely different. So that hasn't proved to be very useful. People then tried the thing that is kind of underpinning some of the discussions here. From the 1920s onwards, there was a focus on these as small things, and maybe that smallness related to the function, maybe it was part of the distinctiveness. So McCarthy, Bramall and Noon in 1946 described these as generally limited to about 3 centimetres in length. They called them pygmy implements or microliths, and all these sort of crescentic, bilaterally symmetrical things they talked about as geometric microliths. And this reference to size seemed to work for people in Australia. It was thought to be quite effective. It was employed by John Mulvaney so that he had, so this is his microlith graph here, and you can see that at some point in time, so this is depth below the ground surface in his famous site, at some point in time they appear, and he thought that denoted the appearance of hafting because they were so small it couldn't use them unless they were hafted and so on. So a lot of those associations about being on projectiles are still sort of embedded within that. Sorry, bad pun, embedded. But the problem is, of course, that often they are small, but sometimes they're not. And so Australian archaeologists found themselves in a context where they were defining something by size, but they would come across examples, whole suites of sites where the size definition didn't fit. So this is a huge quarry. It's got several million specimens on it. It's got hundreds of thousands of retouched flakes, and that's a 10 centimetre bar. So they're backed all the way along. It's a regional variant where these things are really quite large, and yet they are morphologically identical to the things that would be called microliths, except they're not micro. So the size thing seems effective in some locations, but as soon as you go to other locations, you find that your classification changes based on an arbitrary value of size, and it does. You know, you can shift that boundary up or down, but it's still arbitrary. And there's John Evans' famous picture of one of these items from his book. So people also tried shape. They wanted to try and differentiate different forms, scrapers from projectile points from these things based on shapes. They tried symmetry. They tried noting that there were asymmetrical ones. Part of the problem was that as soon as they went to classifications of shape, the symmetrical things like the crescents got put in one category, and the asymmetrical ones were labelled as points and got put in with bifacial points. So as a sort of, a branching classificatory tree, that seemed very strange. It seemed strange to them at the time in the 1940s, and it's very strange still. That division was employed throughout the 1970s. McCarthy eventually put them back together as a variant within the backed group rather than as being entirely separate. And that was explored with things like length-width ratios in the 1970s by people like Bob Pearce. And we can see that across the entire continent, the things like the length-width ratio and the symmetry indices vary quite dramatically and in quite a patterned way. So the difficulty is, as people have been saying this morning, is that a definition made for any one region is going to apply in some regions but is going to struggle to be effective in other regions. Now, part of the problem is that, of course, symmetry and shape are two different things. You can have symmetrical triangles or asymmetrical triangles and so on. So the question that they were posing, in a sense, wasn't matched by the kind of criteria that they were employing. They wanted one thing, but they were using criteria that didn't quite do that. You can also see that when you metrically assess symmetry, that there's a big overlap between the conventional divisions of people in the 60s and 70s of specimens into symmetrical and asymmetrical, and that big overlap is due to the fact that they're not actually using symmetry there, they're using other elements of shape. So there's obviously a kind of a practice that was not explained by the definitions that they were using. There were more rules than they were admitting to. From the 1960s onwards, people imported a kind of concept that derived from Europe that these backed, retouched, blunted items were made on a particular kind of blank, particularly the long bladey things, and this was offered as an explanation for why these objects appeared in the archaeological record at a certain point. There was an enabling technology. You couldn't make them without a blade technology, and as soon as you got a blade technology, you could then produce the blanks that would enable you to do them. And in the 1970s, that made everyone feel happy because they could say, well, the dingo was introduced 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, and the blade technology came with it. And once the blade technology was in Australia, then you could make the backed artefacts and so on and so on. Of course, none of this actually works. So, for instance, if you look at sites that have assemblages both before and after the appearance of lots of these kind of retouched items, what you'll find is that if they have a lot of bladey kinds of flakes in the late prehistoric period, they also have a lot earlier. And if they have very few earlier, they also have very few late. In other words, there's regional variation that's site-specific about the kind of technology. It's not a chronological change, it's actually a geographical pattern. The next thing is that people depicted the arrival of blade technologies, and they used these data. So this is the pattern of breakage for flakes in the Kenneth Cave sequence, and what you can see is the period when blade technology is said to have appeared actually coincides with certainly some subtle technological shift in which lots of flakes break longitudinally, and so they appear to become more elongate, but it's actually mostly the breakage that's happening. And then the final thing is that the big pulse of people retouching things in this manner is not a new thing. In fact, the production of these backed artefacts goes back to about 15 to 20,000. So the technology's been around a long time, but it only became the dominant way of operating at a particular time period. So the enabling technology blade connection doesn't work on any of those grounds. Then 20 years ago, 25 years ago, Val Attenborough and I argued that the thing that united all the specimens that we were talking about was the particular form of retouching. Often very steep retouching, perhaps retouched angles between, say, 70 and about 110 degrees, often with bi-directional backing at some points. Sorry, that's a bad pun too. At some locations, this was the thing that all of those objects that I've shown you shared in common. It wasn't size, it wasn't plan shape, it was this form of retouching, and that's really what people had actually been talking about. So that if you wanted to, so there's actually that's a mean and standard deviation on the retouched edge angle. If you wanted to have a single criteria that might help you identify those objects as different from other kinds of retouched objects, then that form of retouching would be useful. And that brings me back to this notion that metrically, in using multivariate analysis, you can separate those objects based on that criteria. So look, the experience from Australia, I think it's not that we have everything right, but I think it's worth looking at how different places are exploring these issues. And the first thing that you have to say is that it depends entirely on the question that you're asking. You can't divorce the question from the classificatory decisions that you make. And that in Australia, where people have been wanting to map geographically and chronologically these kinds of retouch flakes, then criteria like size, shape, function and blank haven't been very effective at that, because none of them actually pick up in a very robust manner the identity of those things that have retouching. And why would they? Why would blank shape or size tell you about the nature of retouching? So backing retouches turned out to be a more powerful characteristic for allocating things on these classes, and it's led to some challenges internally. Is that people using these, a different criteria like backing retouch have all of a sudden seen that they should be thinking that perhaps there are similarities between big things and little things, whereas previously, based on size, they'd separated those out. Now the problem is that the traditional classes tend to be multi-dimensional, and you can't replicate them in any single way. Listening this morning, I actually think that while you're having a discussion about what name you will give, you're actually exploring all sorts of different things. And I presume that you have different questions that underpin that. And the problem is that because the conventional divisions that we've received, the classificatory divisions that we've received historically from our scholarly ancestors are multidimensional, that it's actually quite difficult to pick one or two characteristics and say, well, this will do the job, or this will repeat what we've all been talking about in the past. So, I mean, my feeling is that, kind of morphometric analysis, statistical analysis is going to be a more powerful way to bring out the patterns that exist in an assemblage. And so, in the sort of statistical calculations that I did in Australia, if I used 7 variables, I could replicate the traditional typological classifications with a fair degree of success. It wasn't actually my goal. I don't care whether I repeat the traditional characterisations. I'm actually interested in addressing questions that I have now. But I tried for years to pick out 1 or 2 things that would do the job, and it simply didn't work. You need a constellation of things to be able to separate out these varied 3-dimensional objects. So it is possible to map the kinds of retouch forms that we're interested in, that I'm interested in Australia, and that obviously you're all interested in various parts of the world. But I think we have to take powerful and robust approaches to this. And I think it is interesting to have the kind of discussions that we've had this morning, and they're valuable. But in the end, it's for me, and because I'm a kind of outsider, it doesn't matter what you decide, but for me, taking a vote on whether we'll call it one thing or call it the other thing is not going to solve any of the problems that you have. Oh. And I've just said all that, so it's the same stuff. So, thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Steve?
The culture history of Australia is fairly well known now, isn't it? Maybe not the dating
look, depending on whether you're applying for a research grant, you might claim that, yeah.
But these culture histories were basically developed upon draw upon typology.
Absolutely, just like they were everywhere in the world. And it worked because those 19th century typologies that were employed in the 20th century were trialled and selected. There were, if you look back historically at the literature, there's all sorts of varieties, and the ones that ended up getting used were the ones that were sensitive to chronological and spatial variants. And so it does establish the classification at one level. But the difficulty is that because these classes are multidimensional, different people can weight different characteristics. And so one of the things that you find is that when I go through museum collections, I find, the oldest specimen, they've got a lot of real retouched flakes, but the oldest specimen isn't one of those. But for them, because of the criteria they're using, it fell in. So the culture history is well established at one level, but at another level, we've completely revised the chronology by kind of renewing and re-envisioning the sort of classificatory approach that we take.
Well, the point I want to take, no pun intended, make is that for many parts of Africa, including where I work, the Horn of Africa, we don't have a culture history. We don't even have industries recognized, for example, in Ethiopia for the late Pleistocene at all. Not one. And so we're really starting in a very basic way to try to understand what the variability is within this region. And to do that, we really need some kind of way of talking to each other. And this is through typology in part. Now, I'm going to argue when I talk that, this isn't the end of, by all means, it's only the beginning. But it plays an important role in our initial understanding of variability within a region. And if we don't develop some kind of standardization in terminology, we're never even going to be able to get to that point.
Look, thanks for that. Look, I completely understand what you're saying. In a sense, you're having to go through the history of archaeology, but kind of in a contemporary manner in your region. And I do understand what you're saying. So my point is not that for heuristic devices you might invent a classificatory system that you could share. Of course that can work. But my point is that it will work only up to a certain level. Is that having a standardised classificatory approach enhances comparison and diminishes your capacity to test theories about the why questions. Intrinsically, it does that. So inventing heuristic classifications is very good for establishing chronological change, and it's been very bad for going on and exploring that. And I'm simply making the point that we should all teach our students the distinction between those two things, because you might want to do it and you might want to stop doing it at some point.
I totally agree.
Peter, just a question on the research question side of things. With the early work in Australia and yours subsequent and those in between, have the research questions changed?
Yes.
They have?
Yes. You want a 2-minute summary of the context? Okay. Look, the early research questions were the kinds of sort of fundamentals that we're talking about. So they were things like, how old is human occupation in the continent? Is there any change? Because of course there was always this issue that Aboriginals could presume not to have changed. Then once you found changes, were they associated with an environmental shift or with the introduction of the dingo? So it was just establishing associations and space-time patterns. But we have reached a point, we've reached a point where in some regions we know that, and in other regions we don't know it, and perhaps it doesn't need to be our focus anymore. They may or may not differ from the regions in which we do have those frameworks, but it's no longer our central question. So, I mean, my own concerns have been why is there such a level of standardisation in the metrical sense that you're talking about in the products of these things? We haven't yet established, in the sense you're talking about, whether there is standardisation in the production systems that lead to them. So it's possible that we have standardised outputs for large areas, but through different production systems. And so that's one question. But all of my thinking over quite a long period now about the standardisation has led me to want to look at the mechanisms by which that standardisation is maintained across space and through time. And I don't think it can be functional. I think the functional variation shows that it's been maintained despite quite different functions. They're often hafted. We have lots of evidence for hafting, and you might argue that there's some sort of standardised hafting mechanism that requires it's the selective context for keeping a standardised form, but that's not really well documented. Increasingly, I'm moving towards thinking that these are sending public signals. They're locally standardised, but they vary between regions. They're not traded in, and so one of the things that I think is happening is that people they're using them, just like you can drive a Maserati, but the Maserati is sending signals very definitely, and these are sending social signals probably within the group rather than between groups. And so the question that I have at the moment is that, I haven't shown any distribution maps, but the distribution of these things runs across the southern 2/3 of Australia, and it almost exactly co-occurs with one language family. So I'm now investigating, I'm trying to extract a phylogenetic signal from the artefacts to match against the phylolinguistic signal that's been derived from that language spread to see if they track in the same ways. So those are the kind of questions that I'm asking, and the 1930s typologies won't do that for me. They weren't designed for that. There's no reason they should do that. And if I was asking the same questions that were being asked in the 1920s, then those classifications at some level would probably still be useful for that purpose. Details. None of those scars are shown. He's operating on general shape, not being a modern archaeologist. Now, the original paper by Etheridge and Whiteleg cited reports such as Browth-Smythe's description of the death spear thing. We now know that first of all, the death spears are not kind of real in Australia. They're a post-contact depiction. That secondly, that the backed artefacts disappeared more than 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, so they don't have a real connection with the ethnographic record. So a lot of the attempts to, understandable attempts to understand these archaeological objects by reference to the ethnography, that was the first thing that people tried, but didn't terribly work. However, the notion that these things would be mounted on spears caught hold. It was employed by McCarthy in the 1960s and 70s. It's still reproduced by Richard Fulliger today, and it's widely discussed. So hello, it's very nice to be here to talk to you. I'm principally going to talk to you about lithic material from Australia, and I'm doing that for a number of reasons. One is, in a sense, to challenge you with something different, and another is to show solidarity. The fact that in many parts of the world we're all exploring the same kinds of concerns. And so I think that it's a good opportunity for me to briefly summarise some of the attempts to move towards standard classifications in Australia and why they don't really work. Now, the fundamental reason, I'm going to talk about a bit about the history of labelling, particularly the backed specimens in Australia, and the history of working in Australia shows that. So people have tried to define things in terms of function, functional associations, or size, or shape, or the association to particular blanks for these retouched items, or backing. So let me just quickly work through this. Now, the first thing I have to say is that if we do a morphometric study and do it in multivariate space, that the things that we're talking about, these backed objects, do fall out compared to other retouched objects. So it is possible to not just have sort of vague or even moderately well-defined divisions, but to actually measure this material, measure the angles, the dimensions, the ratios, and come up for any particular site or location with quite clear and robust means for differentiating them. And the second thing I would say is that, of course, there have been quite a lot of different criteria used. The fundamental problem, though, is that we need to come back and think about what these classifications do. Typological systems in archaeology, classification in general, is a way of labelling groups so that we can explore similarity and difference. And the consequence of that is that, of course, we need different divisions and different labels when we address different questions. So my viewpoint has always been that attempting to standardise a single classificatory framework is bound to fail, because it's not going to allow you to sensitively measure the variation that you want to explore for every question. It's a really good idea for some questions, but it's self-limiting in the sense that it must, by definition, address some of the questions that you have in mind at the moment, but it can't address all the questions that everyone might ask for it. It's talking to an audience who's highly skilled, so you'll all recognise that it's a retouched backed item at the top and an unretouched ridge straightening flake off a core at the bottom. But of course, it's very common when you go through museum collections that many of the unretouched things that have lots of scars on the dorsal ridges have been mislabelled. And hence the reason why trusting the counts published in the literature is not always a good idea. So this category of things that we're generally talking about, of items that are retouched bluntly, were first identified in Australia in 1901 and published in 1907. And it was published by Robert Etheridge, who worked in a natural science context at the Australian Museum, and he talked about them, he described them as chipped-backed surgical knives. And this is one of his illustrations, and the great thing about the illustration is you immediately know what it is, and you immediately know that he didn't know what he was really looking at, because there's no